If you lived in America in 1977, you don't need to be told what this winter was. You remember turning the thermostat up and feeling nothing. You remember the radio saying limit travel and realizing that didn't mean traffic. It meant rescue. This wasn't the coldest winter on paper. It was the winter that stayed. Week after week, the temperature never broke. Wind turned streets into walls, cars disappeared, paychecks stopped, and millions of Americans learned for the first time that modern life could still freeze in place. People didn't panic. They waited. And that's what made it dangerous, because by the time everyone understood this wasn't passing through, the roads were already gone. This is the winter older Americans still lower their voices when they talk about it. The winter that didn't feel historic until it was over. The winter of 1977 to 1978 didn't arrive like a disaster. That's what made it dangerous. There was no single night when America went to sleep warm and woke up frozen. Instead, the cold crept in slowly, settled deep, and then refused to leave. By early January, large parts of the Midwest and Northeast were already locked below freezing, but people kept telling themselves it was temporary. That was the mistake. In cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, and Cincinnati, temperatures stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like a condition. Day after day, the thermometer never climbed above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In Chicago alone, the city endured more than 40 consecutive days below freezing, something most living residents had never experienced. Wind chills dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even near minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Lake Michigan began forming thick ice sheets along the shoreline, something that felt wrong even to people who had grown up beside it. This wasn't the dramatic snow people remembered from postcards or movies. This was dry, punishing cold that cracked pavement, burst pipes inside walls, and turned ordinary commutes into risks. Schools stayed open at first, factories tried to keep running, and families kept paying heating bills that suddenly doubled or tripled because shutting down felt unthinkable. Radios warned people to limit travel. Gas companies quietly issued conservation notices, but no one said the word emergency yet. And that silence mattered, because by the time Americans realized this winter wasn't passing through, that it had settled in and claimed the season, the infrastructure was already straining. Homes built for comfort, not survival, began losing heat faster than furnaces could replace it. Pipes froze not in abandoned buildings, but in occupied homes, while families slept. Cars failed in driveways. Batteries died overnight. What made this winter unforgettable wasn't one record-breaking number. It was the feeling that the cold had taken control of time itself, stretching January into something endless, something heavy, something people would later describe not with statistics, but with sentences like, "It just didn't stop." By the time Americans understood the cold wasn't leaving, the systems they trusted were already beginning to fail in quiet, unsettling ways. This was the late 1970s, a period when people believed modern life had solved winter. Central heating was normal, highways were constant, power was assumed. But the winter of 1977 to 1978 exposed how thin that confidence really was. Natural gas supplies, stretched by weeks of nonstop demand, dropped to dangerous levels across the Midwest and Northeast. Utilities issued urgent conservation orders, not suggestions, telling households to lower thermostats, shut off unused rooms, and avoid non-essential heating. In some areas, pressure fell so low that furnaces simply stopped working, even though homes were still connected. Factories shut their doors not because of strikes or shortages of labor, but because water lines froze solid inside the walls, flooding buildings once they thawed. Thousands of workers in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan were sent home indefinitely. Paychecks paused in the middle of winter, while bills kept arriving on time. Schools closed not from snow days, but because classrooms could no longer be heated safely. Emergency rooms filled with cases that didn't look dramatic on the surface. Frostbite from short walks, carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heaters, heart attacks from people shoveling in air so cold it burned the lungs. What made this moment frightening wasn't panic. It was normality continuing under stress. People still went to work until they couldn't. Still drove until cars wouldn't start. Still trusted that help would come if something went wrong. But response times stretched. Tow trucks stopped running. Ambulances took longer. And in neighborhoods where elderly residents lived alone, the cold became something else entirely. Not an inconvenience, not a challenge, but a silent test of whether anyone would notice when the heat went out and didn't come back on. The moment that sealed the winter of 1977 to 1978 into American memory didn't arrive with a warning, it arrived with wind. On January 26, 1978, a massive storm system collided with Arctic air over the Midwest and Northeast. And what followed wasn't just a blizzard, but a complete environmental takeover. Winds accelerated to 80, 90, in some places nearly 100 miles per hour, strong enough to pick up loose objects, overturn trucks, and erase roadways in minutes. Snow didn't fall gently, it moved sideways, packed so tightly by wind that it filled doorways, sealed cars shut, and buried streets under drifts that reached 15, 20, even 25 feet high in parts of Ohio, New York, and New England. Entire interstate highways vanished beneath white walls, and drivers who had set out for short trips found themselves stranded in conditions so cold that engines froze solid while they were still running. Thousands of cars were abandoned where they stopped, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as people realized they could no longer see the road, no longer feel their hands, no longer trust that staying inside the vehicle was safer than stepping out into the wind. Cities like Cleveland, Toledo, Buffalo, and Boston effectively shut down. Public transportation stopped moving. Airports closed indefinitely. Emergency services were overwhelmed not by a single disaster site, but by everything failing everywhere at once. Snowplows couldn't keep up because the wind-filled, cleared roads faster than they could be plowed. Ambulances became stuck. Fire trucks were rerouted or abandoned. In rural areas, entire communities were cut off for days, sometimes weeks, reachable only by snowmobile or not at all. Inside homes, power flickered or went out entirely, and the cold pressed inward, room by room, until families gathered in single spaces, burning whatever heat they could safely control, listening to battery-powered radios for updates that offered no relief. Governors issued travel bans that felt unprecedented at the time, telling people not just to stay home, but to stop moving altogether, because rescue might not reach them if they tried. And as the storm passed, it didn't reveal relief. It revealed the scale of what had happened. Streets looked abandoned. Neighborhoods were silent. Familiar landscapes had been reshaped into something unrecognizable. The blizzard didn't end the winter. It exposed it, showing Americans what weeks of unbroken cold had been building toward. A moment where the country wasn't just frozen, but immobilized, forced to confront how quickly normal life could disappear when the environment decided not to cooperate. When the snow finally stopped moving and the wind eased, what remained wasn't relief, it was reckoning. The true cost of the winter of 1977 to 1978 revealed itself slowly, in basements, hospital rooms, and quiet homes that hadn't answered the phone in days. Official reports counted more than 100 deaths tied directly to the cold and storms, but those numbers never captured the full picture. Many people didn't freeze outdoors in dramatic scenes. They died indoors, trying to stay warm. Carbon monoxide poisoning became a hidden killer as families used ovens, grills, kerosene heaters, or improvised burners in enclosed spaces. Elderly Americans living alone were especially vulnerable. Heat failed, phones went dead, doors were blocked by snow, and help arrived too late. Hospitals saw waves of frostbite cases from exposures that lasted only minutes, and heart attacks surged as people pushed their bodies to shovel dense, wind-packed snow that felt heavier than anything they had moved before. In working-class neighborhoods, the damage carried a financial weight that lasted long after the ice melted. Burst pipes flooded homes and apartments, destroying furniture, photographs, and keepsakes that insurance often didn't fully cover. Families already strained by rising energy costs faced repair bills they couldn't afford, while lost workdays turned into lost pay. For many Americans, this winter marked the first time they felt truly powerless inside their own homes, not because of poverty or neglect, but because the systems they depended on failed under sustained pressure. The cold didn't just interrupt life, it reshaped routines, trust, and memory. People stopped assuming that heat would always be there, that roads would always be cleared, that emergency help would always arrive on time. Long after the snowbanks disappeared, those who lived through it carried a quiet awareness that modern comfort had limits, and that once those limits were crossed, survival became personal, private, and frighteningly fragile. What made the winter of 1977 to 1978 different from other cold seasons wasn't just what happened during it, it was what lingered afterward. Long after the snow melted and temperatures climbed back into something recognizable as spring, the winter stayed alive in people's habits, conversations, and quiet decisions. Older Americans didn't remember it as a headline or a statistic. They remembered it as a feeling that settled into daily life and never fully left. The way people hesitated before turning down the thermostat. The way they checked on elderly neighbors more often, the way storms stopped being entertainment and started being taken personally. This winter rewired behavior. In many households, the cold forced families into physical closeness they weren't prepared for. People slept in living rooms instead of bedrooms, stacking blankets, wearing coats indoors, keeping doors shut to trap heat in a single space. Parents rationed warmth without saying the word ration, deciding which rooms mattered and which didn't. Children grew up fast during those weeks, learning that comfort was conditional. For some, it was the first time they understood that adults didn't always have control, that heat, food delivery, emergency response, and paychecks could all disappear at the same time. That realization stayed with them into adulthood. Municipal governments quietly changed after 1978. Cities revised snow emergency plans. States expanded travel ban authority. Utilities reworked fuel reserve calculations. But those changes happened slowly and without ceremony because admitting vulnerability was uncomfortable. The winter had revealed something deeply unsettling. Modern America was efficient but not durable. Systems were designed to function under normal stress, not prolonged pressure. Heating grids assumed cold spells, not endless cold. Transportation assumed storms, not immobilization. Emergency services assumed access, not isolation. The winter didn't destroy these systems. It showed their breaking points. Economically, the impact rippled far beyond the storm itself. Small businesses that closed for weeks never reopened. Hourly workers lost income they never recovered. Repair costs drained savings that had taken years to build. Insurance disputes dragged on for months. For families already living close to the edge, the winter pushed them over without warning. And unlike more visible disasters, there were no dramatic rebuilding efforts, no national fundraisers, no clear moment of recovery. Life simply resumed, unevenly. Some homes were fixed, some damage was lived with, some losses were never replaced. What made the winter unforgettable for so many wasn't fear, it was abandonment. Not intentional abandonment, but situational. Roads couldn't be cleared, emergency vehicles couldn't move. Help didn't stop caring, it stopped reaching. That distinction matters. People realized that in extreme conditions, survival wasn't about heroism or preparedness alone. It was about proximity, timing, and luck. Whether your furnace failed at noon or midnight. Whether someone checked on you before or after the storm peaked. Whether you lived on a main road or a side street. These were the margins where outcomes were decided. Culturally, the winter became a quiet reference point. Colder than 78 entered conversations. Parents warned children about storms by comparing them to that year. Weather forecasts were judged against it. It became a benchmark, not because it was the coldest ever, but because it was the most disruptive many living Americans had experienced in a modern context. It shattered the assumption that history belonged to the past. This wasn't pioneer hardship. This wasn't black and white footage. This happened with color television, electric heat, supermarkets, and cars in every driveway. And still, it brought the country to a crawl. Perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. After 1978, winter stopped being background noise. It became something to negotiate with. People stocked supplies differently. They paid attention to fuel warnings. They listened to weather reports with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. The season earned respect, and for those who lived through it, every severe winter since has carried a faint echo, a memory that resurfaces when temperatures refuse to rise, when the wind won't stop, when the forecast keeps extending the cold just a few days further. The winter of 1977 to 1978 didn't announce itself as historic. It didn't arrive with fanfare or leave with closure. It simply stayed too long, pressed too hard, and revealed too much. That's why it still lives in memory. Not as a story people tell loudly, but as one they recognize instantly when reminded. A winter that taught a modern nation something ancient and uncomfortable. Warmth is never guaranteed. Systems are never permanent. And sometimes survival depends less on preparation than on endurance. Waiting quietly for something relentless to finally let go. What makes the winter of 1977 to 1978 truly unsettling isn't that it happened. It's how quickly its lesson faded. Once temperatures rose and the snowbanks retreated, America did what it often does best. It moved on. Roads were cleared, pipes were repaired, paychecks resumed, and within a few years, the winter was filed away as an anomaly, a bad season, a story older people told when the weather turned cold again. But beneath that surface normalcy, something important was missed. The winter hadn't been a freak accident. It was a stress test, and the results were quietly ignored. The systems that faltered in 1978 were not rebuilt from the ground up. They were patched. Heating infrastructure remained optimized for efficiency, not endurance. Energy grids continued to assume short spikes, not sustained demand. Housing codes improved in places, but millions of older homes remained vulnerable, relying on aging furnaces, thin insulation, and uninterrupted fuel delivery. The margin of safety revealed by that winter didn't widen. It narrowed as populations grew, systems interconnected, and dependency deepened. The country became more comfortable and more exposed. There was also a psychological shift that worked against preparedness. As winters in the 1980s and 1990s became generally milder, the memory of 1977 to 1978 softened. What had once felt like a warning began to feel like an exaggeration. Stories turned into nostalgia. Hardship became anecdote. The idea that modern America could be immobilized by cold started to sound outdated, almost unrealistic. Technology advanced. Forecasting improved. Backup systems multiplied. Confidence returned. Quietly, completely. But resilience isn't built on confidence. It's built on redundancy, and redundancy is expensive. Maintaining fuel reserves that might never be used. Designing infrastructure for extremes that may not arrive for decades. Training emergency responses for scenarios that seem implausible in normal years. These are hard investments to justify politically and economically, and so they were minimized. The winter of 1977 to 1978 was treated as a historical outlier rather than a preview. For those who lived through it, that dismissal never fully sat right. They noticed how quickly people forgot, how easily discomfort replaced caution, how fast the assumption returned that help would always arrive, that heat would always turn on, that the roads would always be cleared by morning. They remembered how close things came to slipping further, how a few more weeks of cold, a few more system failures could have turned a crisis into something darker. That's why this winter still matters. Not because it was the coldest on record, not because it was the deadliest in raw numbers, but because it happened in a modern, interconnected nation and showed how thin the line really was. The winter didn't need to break America to prove its point. It only needed to slow it, isolate it, and make millions of people feel, briefly and uncomfortably, what it's like when normal life pauses and no one knows how long the pause will last. The winter of 1977 to 1978 didn't end with a lesson learned. It ended with a lesson available, waiting to be remembered the next time the cold decides not to leave.